The transport plane's ramp lowered with a hydraulic groan, spitting Sergeant Emily Harper into the biting wind of forward operating base Kestrel's perch. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of diesel fumes and impending snow. No one was there to meet her. A few soldiers hauling jerrycans shot her a passing glance, their eyes cataloging her ill-fitting standard-issue fatigues, the unfamiliar patch on her shoulder from a logistics unit that had been disbanded 3 years ago, and the duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She was just another body, a replacement cog for a machine that was always grinding down its parts. They saw a woman past her prime with tired eyes and a face that held its secrets like a locked vault. They saw a problem someone else had passed along. She found her assigned barracks, a prefabricated tin box humming with the sound of a struggling heater. Inside, a group of younger soldiers were gathered around a burned barrel, its flames licking at the low ceiling and casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was a ritual of sorts, a way to clear out the unwanted gear of departed soldiers and make a little space. A burly corporal with a shaved head and a cruel smile was feeding the fire. He picked up a worn pink flight jacket from a pile of discarded equipment. It was Emily's. She'd left it on her bunk to be sorted later. The jacket was old, its canvas faded by sun and time, the wool collar matted. The patches had been meticulously removed long ago, but their faint outlines remained like ghosts. The shadow of a wing, a shield, a name she no longer used. "Hey, look at this relic," the corporal grunted, holding it up for the others. "Probably from the last Great War." Laughter rippled through the small group. He didn't know what it was. To him, it was just old trash. Without a second thought, he balled it up and tossed it into the flames. Emily stood in the doorway, unseen for a moment. She watched the fire catch the sleeve. The pink canvas blackened, curled, and then erupted into a bright, hungry orange. She remembered the man who had given her that jacket, the feel of his hand on her shoulder as he'd said, "You earned this, Shadow. Wear it well." She remembered the smell of jet fuel and the cold of high altitude. She remembered the faces of the team, all gone now. Ghosts like the stitched outlines on the cloth. The fire consumed it all, turning memory into ash. She didn't flinch. Her expression remained a placid mask of indifference. She simply stepped inside, her boots silent on the gritty floor, and walked past them toward her bunk. The smell of burning wool and history filled the air. The soldiers fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats as they felt her presence. They watched her, suddenly uneasy. She hadn't said a word, but her silence was heavier and more unnerving than any shouted reprimand. They had burned her pink jacket, a piece of her past she had carried for a decade. And in the quiet that followed, they had no idea that they had just awakened a past that was supposed to stay buried. Colonel Grayson looked at the file on his desk and then at the woman standing before him. The file was an insult. It was 3 pages long, and 2.5 of those were solid black bars of redaction. Sergeant Emily Harper, transferred from the 77th Archival Command, a unit he'd never heard of and which sounded suspiciously like a place they sent soldiers to be forgotten. Her service record was a ghost. No commendations, no disciplinary actions, no history of deployments, just a name and a rank. He hated mysteries. Mysteries were liabilities. His office was a reflection of his personality, rigid, orderly, and devoid of warmth. Maps of the surrounding mountain ranges were pinned to the walls with geometric precision. The air was stale with the scent of day-old coffee and antiseptic cleaner. Grayson was a man who believed in the tangible, in things he could measure. Marksmanship scores, patrol reports, troop formations. Sergeant Emily Harper was an anomaly. An unquantifiable variable dropped into his carefully managed equation. "Sergeant," he began, his voice flat and dismissive. He didn't invite her to sit. "Your file is the most useless piece of paper I've had the displeasure of reading this year. It tells me nothing, which in my experience means one of 2 things. Either you are incredibly important, or you are a catastrophic failure that someone is trying to bury. Given that you were sent here to the armpit of the world, I'm leaning toward the latter." Emily stood at perfect parade rest, her gaze fixed on the wall just over his shoulder. She didn't react to the insult. Her stillness was absolute, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that usually filled his office. It was the stillness of a predator, not of prey, and it pricked at the edges of his composure. "I don't have time for puzzles, Sergeant," he continued, tapping a pen against the redacted file. "This is a forward operating base in a contested zone. We have active hostiles, extreme weather, and a supply line that's tenuous at best. I need soldiers who follow orders, carry their weight, and fit into the chain of command. I don't need ghosts with redacted histories." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "So tell me, what am I supposed to do with you?" "Whatever you require, sir," Emily replied. Her voice was low and even, betraying no emotion. It was as blank as her file. The answer irritated him. It was too simple, too correct. It gave him no leverage. He wanted a reaction. Anger, fear, frustration. He got nothing. He sighed, a gust of pure exasperation. "Fine. You want to be useful? You're assigned to logistics. Sergeant Carter is in charge of the supply depot. You'll report to him. You'll count bullets. You'll inventory MREs. You'll inspect bootlaces for fraying for all I care." He stood up, a clear dismissal. "This is a frontline unit, Harper. The men and women outside this office are warriors. Your job is to make sure they have what they need to do their jobs. Stay out of their way. Is that clear?" "Crystal, sir," she said. The single word, delivered with the same unnerving calm, was the final straw. He felt a surge of anger at her placid discipline, felt like she was mocking him with her composure. He wanted to provoke her, to see a crack in the facade. "One more thing, Sergeant. That pink jacket you came here with, the old one. I heard some of the men used it for kindling. Good. This is a modern army. We don't have room for sentimental relics. Remember that." He expected a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of pain, a flash of anger. There was nothing. She simply held his gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable. A silent, unreadable challenge. Then she executed a perfect about-face and walked out of his office, the door closing softly behind her. Colonel Grayson was left alone in the silence, the ghost file on his desk feeling heavier than before. He had dismissed her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a profound and dangerous miscalculation. The logistics warehouse was a cavern of cold steel and neglect. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light filtering through grime-caked windows. It was a place of forgotten things, crates of obsolete radio batteries, pallets of winter gear with dry-rotted seams, and weapons turned in for maintenance that had been sitting for months. It was exactly the kind of place a commander sent someone he wanted to disappear. For Sergeant Emily Harper, it was a sanctuary of purpose. Sergeant Carter, a man whose guts strained the buttons of his uniform, gave her a cursory tour. "Here's the inventory list," he grunted, handing her a stained clipboard. "It's probably wrong. Just count stuff. Yell if you find the crate of coffee filters we lost last month." Then he retreated to his small, heated office to nurse a mug of lukewarm coffee and ignore her existence. Emily didn't just count. She worked with a quiet, methodical intensity that was both unsettling and awe-inspiring to the few junior soldiers assigned to the depot. She started in one corner and moved through the warehouse like a force of nature. Chaos yielded to her order. She didn't just stack crates. She organized them by priority, date, and unit designation. She didn't just inventory the MREs. She checked the heater packs and rotated the stock, ensuring the oldest were used first. Her real work, however, began when the others left. In the quiet hours of the evening, she moved from the logistics of supply to the logistics of survival. She found the neglected weapons, standard M4 carbines, left coated in a fine layer of dust, their optics clouded. She took them one by one to a small workbench in the back. She stripped them down to their component parts, cleaning away the carbon scoring and grime with a surgeon's precision. She oiled the mechanisms, calibrated the laser sights against a mark on the far wall, and reassembled them with the fluid economy of motion that comes only from thousands of hours of practice. The rifles she returned to the arms room were no longer just standard issue. They were perfectly tuned instruments of lethality. Specialist Noah Bennett, a young communications tech, was the first to notice. He was a quiet observer by nature, a man who saw patterns others missed. He saw Sergeant Harper in the mess hall, not eating, but watching. She tracked the intricate social dynamics of the different squads, noting who the leaders were, who the weak links were, who was distracted. He saw her in the comms tent late at night, ostensibly to check on radio battery shipments. But her eyes were always on the tactical map, studying the patrol routes the squads took through the treacherous mountain passes. She traced the lines with her gaze, her expression thoughtful, analytical. He saw her near the perimeter fence during a light snowfall, standing perfectly still, seemingly just watching the snowfall. But Bennett noticed she was watching the wind, how it created drifts against the fence line, how it carried sound, how it would affect sensor placement. One evening, he saw her testing the trigger pull on a rifle she had just cleaned. The rifle was empty, but she handled it with an ingrained respect, a familiarity that went far beyond basic training. He approached her cautiously. "That's Sergeant Hayes's rifle, isn't it?" he asked. Emily didn't look up from her work. "It is." "He was complaining it kept jamming on the range," Bennett said. "The gas tube was fouled," Emily stated simply, working the charging handle. The sound was crisp, clean, perfect. "It won't jam now." She looked at him then, her eyes seeming to assess every detail about him in a single glance. It wasn't hostile, but it was intensely analytical. "You're good at that," Bennett said, feeling suddenly out of his depth. "It's important work," she said, echoing Colonel Grayson's dismissive words. But her tone was different. When she said it, it sounded like the absolute truth. She wasn't just counting bullets. She was studying the entire ecosystem of the base, learning its rhythms, its strengths, and most importantly, its vulnerabilities. And Specialist Bennett, watching her, had the distinct feeling that she was preparing for a test that no one else even knew was coming. The pressure began as a whisper of wind, a subtle drop in barometric pressure that the overworked meteorology corporal dismissed as a minor squall. Within an hour, the whisper became a roar. A blizzard born in the unforgiving peaks of the north descended on FOB Kestrel's perch with savage fury. It was a wall of white, a churning vortex of snow and ice that reduced visibility to zero and clawed at the base with winds that screamed like banshees. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the atmosphere was as turbulent as the storm outside. The TOC was the base's nerve center, a dimly lit space filled with the low hum of electronics and the tense murmur of voices. Colonel Grayson stood before the main command screen, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim frustration. The largest monitor, the one that displayed the feed from the Argus relay, was black. "Status?" Grayson barked, his voice cutting through the noise. "Still nothing, sir," a young lieutenant answered, his voice tight with stress. "The entire sensor package on Raptor's Ridge is dark. No video, no thermal, no seismic. It's a total blackout." Raptor's Ridge was their high ground, a jagged peak that overlooked the Anvil Valley, the most likely and most dangerous infiltration route for enemy forces. The Argus relay was their unblinking eye, a sophisticated suite of sensors that provided early warning of any movement in the valley. Without it, they were blind, and the storm was the perfect cover for an attack. Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep into the room. "We have to get a team up there," the lieutenant insisted. "In this?" Grayson shot back, gesturing angrily at a monitor showing the view from a perimeter camera. "A complete whiteout. A ground team would be lucky to make it 100 meters past the wire before getting lost. They'd freeze to death in under an hour. It's suicide." "What about air support, sir?" another officer suggested. The Air Force liaison officer, a captain with a perpetually weary expression, shook his head without even looking up from his console. "Negative, Colonel. Ceiling and visibility are zero. I can't even launch a drone, let alone a bird. Flying in that is just a creative way to crash into a mountain." The options were dwindling. The storm was getting worse, the wind howling against the walls of the command center like a physical assault. Every man in the room could feel their vulnerability. They were isolated, cut off, and blind. The enemy, a hardened group of local insurgents led by a ruthless warlord, knew this terrain. They thrived in these conditions. For them, the blizzard wasn't a hindrance. It was an ally. Grayson paced back and forth, his boots echoing on the steel floor. The pressure was immense. The lives of every soldier on this base rested on his shoulders, and his most critical asset had just been taken off the board. His mind raced through contingency plans, each one more desperate and risky than the last. He could pull the perimeter guards in tighter, seating the outer defenses, but that would make them a more concentrated target. He could send out patrols on tethers, a hopelessly archaic and dangerous tactic. "Sir," Specialist Noah Bennett's voice cut in from the comm station. "I'm picking up faint intermittent chatter on a known insurgent frequency. It's heavily encrypted, but the signal strength is increasing. It seems to be originating from the direction of the Anvil Valley." The news landed like a grenade in the center of the room. They weren't just blind. They were being watched. The enemy was moving, using the storm to mask their approach, and they were likely preparing to strike. The tension in the TOC ratcheted up to an almost unbearable level. They were trapped in a box, and something was outside, circling, waiting for the right moment to break in. Colonel Grayson felt the cold grip of helplessness closing around him. He was out of time and out of options. The heavy steel door to the TOC swung open, letting in a vortex of swirling snow and a blast of Arctic air that made the men inside flinch. A figure stepped through the doorway, and for a moment, it was just a silhouette against the raging white storm. Then the door slammed shut, and the figure resolved into a shape that commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. It was Sergeant Emily Harper, but not as they had ever seen her. She was no longer the unassuming logistics sergeant in baggy fatigues. She was clad in a form-fitting two-piece operational suit of a material that was a flat, non-reflective black. It seemed to absorb the light around it, making her edges indistinct. The suit was sleek, unadorned with the usual bulk of military gear. There were no dangling straps or pouches. Everything was integrated, streamlined. A minimalist webbing harness held a few mission-essential items close to her body. Slung across her back was a compact carbine, its design unfamiliar, fitted with a suppressor and advanced optics. Her face was obscured by a hood and form-fitting goggles with lenses that glowed with a faint internal light. She looked less like a soldier and more like a weapon given human form. The stunned silence in the TOC was absolute. The frantic energy of the crisis evaporated, replaced by a collective, breathless awe. They were looking at a level of equipment and preparation that none of them had ever seen outside of a classified briefing. Emily moved past the stunned officers with a fluid, silent grace, her boots making no sound on the floor. She stopped at the main tactical map, which was still displaying the dead zone where Raptor's Ridge should be. She raised a gloved hand and pointed to a specific contour line on the map. A route that cut straight up the most treacherous face of the mountain. "The north face is a sheer cliff," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. "The wind shear will be severe, but it's the most direct path. It avoids the lower patrol routes and the basin where the enemy will expect a conventional approach. I can be at the relay in 110 minutes. Colonel Grayson stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman who counted blankets with the operator standing before him. His first instinct, born of ingrained authority, was to yell, to demand who she thought she was, to throw her out for her insubordination and for wearing non-regulation gear in his command center. But the words died in his throat. He saw the absolute certainty in her posture, the unwavering professionalism that radiated from her like a physical force. He looked at the dead screen, then back at her. He was a man drowning, and she had just thrown him a line. It might be a line that would snap, a hope that was insane, but it was the only one he had. "Who the hell are you?" one of the lieutenants finally managed to stammer. Emily didn't look at him. Her focus remained entirely on the colonel. She was not asking for permission in the traditional sense. She was stating a capability and awaiting a decision. The choice was his. Cling to protocol and fail, or trust the ghost in his ranks and have a chance. Grayson's jaw was tight, his mind a battlefield of doubt and desperation. He looked at the confident, lethal figure before him and then at the faces of his men who were looking to him for a solution he did not have. He made the only choice he could. He gave a single sharp nod. "Go." Emily didn't reply. She turned and walked back to the door, a silent shadow. She opened it, stepped out into the howling blizzard, and was swallowed by the white. The door closed, leaving the men of the TOC in a profound, echoing silence. The image of the woman in black burned into their minds. A single green dot pulsed with life on a secondary monitor at Specialist Noah Bennett's comm station. It was a standalone screen connected to a small encrypted receiver Emily had handed to Bennett before she left. "Keep this channel private," she had instructed. "It's for the Colonel's eyes only now." That screen was the sole focus of the entire command staff. The green dot was Emily. Against the detailed topographical map overlaid with swirling red and orange weather patterns, the dot began to move. It cleared the perimeter fence and, instead of following any known path, struck out directly toward the base of Raptor's Ridge. Its movement was shockingly fast and brutally efficient. There was no hesitation, no deviation. It was the track of a creature perfectly at home in the storm, not a human struggling against it. "She's heading for the cliff face," the lieutenant whispered, his earlier skepticism replaced by a hushed disbelief. "That's a technical climb. You need ropes, gear. It's impossible in these conditions." Colonel Grayson said nothing. He stood with his arms crossed, his gaze locked on the screen. He was watching the impossible happen. The green dot reached the base of the sheer rock wall and began to ascend. It didn't slow down. It moved upward with a steady, relentless pace that defied logic and gravity. He imagined her out there in the screaming wind, finding handholds and footholds in the ice-slicked rock, pulling herself upward into the heart of the storm. The soldiers who had mocked her, the ones who had burned her pink jacket, had drifted into the TOC, drawn by the palpable tension. They now stood in a silent cluster at the back of the room, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and awe. One of them, the corporal who had tossed the jacket into the fire, stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. The relic he had dismissed belonged to the entity now scaling a cliff in a deadly blizzard. The disconnect was staggering. Bennett, meanwhile, felt a quiet sense of vindication. He had seen the truth of her, the coiled potential beneath the quiet exterior. He monitored her vitals, which were being transmitted along with her position. Her heart rate was elevated but steady. Her core body temperature was stable. She wasn't just surviving out there. She was operating at peak efficiency. "Sir," Bennett said, his voice quiet. "Her ascent rate it's faster than the doctrinal standard for an elite mountain warfare unit in ideal conditions." Grayson's jaw tightened. Every minute that passed, every meter of altitude the green dot gained, was another layer stripped from his assumptions. He had seen her as a problem to be managed, a piece that didn't fit. He had relegated her to the shadows, to a dusty warehouse, convinced he was protecting his command from an unknown liability. Now he understood he hadn't been shelving a problem. He had been benching his single greatest asset. The woman he had dismissed as a ghost was now the only thing standing between his base and annihilation, and she was moving through a storm that should have killed her as if it were a minor inconvenience. The green dot reached the summit of the ridge 109 minutes after she had left the TOC. The room was silent, save for the howl of the wind outside. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the ghost on the mountain to speak. The summit of Raptor's Ridge was a maelstrom of sound and fury. The wind was a solid physical presence, a relentless wall of force that threatened to rip Emily from her footing. Ice crystals driven at hurricane speeds sandblasted every exposed surface. The Argus relay tower was a skeletal specter before her, coated in a thick armor of rime ice, its antennas whipping violently in the gale. Through the advanced optics of her goggles, which filtered the visual chaos into a comprehensible landscape of thermal and light-intensified data, she saw the problem immediately. The main armored power conduit leading from the geothermal generator to the sensor array had been severed. It wasn't a clean cut from a plasma torch or an explosive charge. It was jagged, torn, as if ripped apart by brute force, but the edges of the tear showed signs of extreme localized heat. It wasn't the storm. It was deliberate, and the method was unusual. She keyed her encrypted comms. Her voice, transmitted through a bone conduction microphone in her helmet, was perfectly calm, a stark contrast to the screaming tempest around her. "Grayson, this is Harper. I'm at the relay. The primary power conduit is severed. It's sabotage. I'm beginning repairs." She unslung a small pack from her back and retrieved a multi-tool and a portable plasma welder. The work was difficult. Her gloves, though designed for dexterity, made the fine manipulations a challenge, and the wind fought her every move. As she began stripping the damaged ends of the conduit, a new set of heat signatures bloomed into existence at the edge of her goggles display. 4 of them, moving in a loose skirmish line, using the rocks for cover. They were ascending from the far side of the ridge, believing the storm would mask their approach. They were here to ensure the relay stayed down. "Colonel," she reported, her voice losing none of its composure, "I have company. 4 hostiles converging on my position." In the TOC, Grayson's blood ran cold. A technician, even a highly skilled one, was no match for 4 armed insurgents. She was exposed, alone, and outgunned. He had sent her up there to fix a machine, not to fight a battle. "Harper, pull back now," he ordered, his voice sharp with authority. "Evacuate the summit." "That is a direct order." Emily paused her work for a fraction of a second. She glanced at the approaching heat signatures, now less than 50 meters away. She looked at the severed conduit in her hands. In her mind, a cold, swift calculation was made. The base below was blind. The relay was their eyes. Without it, the insurgents moving through the valley would be on top of the FOB before anyone could react. The lives of hundreds of soldiers depended on this single electronic asset. Her own life was just one variable in that equation. A beat of silence passed over the comms. A silence that stretched for an eternity in the tense atmosphere of the TOC. Then her voice came back, as cold and hard as the ice on the mountain. "Negative, Colonel. The asset is critical." She clipped the plasma welder to her belt. Her hand moved to the compact carbine on her back, drawing it in a single fluid motion. "Engaging," she said. The comm line did not go dead. It remained open, a live feed of the howling wind. And then a new sound joined the storm's chorus, the distinct muffled thump-thump-thump of a suppressed weapon firing in short, controlled bursts. Colonel Grayson stared at the speaker, his own order echoing uselessly in his ears. The logistics sergeant, the ghost from the archives, had just defied a direct order from a full colonel in a combat zone. She had made her choice. She was not evacuating. She was hunting. The world outside Emily's goggles was a swirling white hell, a disorienting vortex where friend and foe could become indistinguishable in a heartbeat. But inside her optics, the world was a clear digital battle space. The 4 hostiles were bright orange silhouettes against the cold blue-gray of the rock and snow. They were moving with confidence, their weapons held at a low ready, convinced their prey was a helpless technician trapped by the storm. This was their first mistake. Emily didn't return fire. She didn't seek cover. She became part of the storm. She moved left, a low, silent shadow against the snow-dusted rocks, the wind masking the whisper of her suit's fabric. The first insurgent, the point man, moved past a rock outcropping, peering into the blizzard, his rifle sweeping an empty space. Emily was already behind him. The suppressed report of her carbine was a soft cough lost in the gale. The orange silhouette crumpled and vanished from her display. 1 down, the remaining 3 heard nothing. They only knew their point man had stopped moving. They paused, confusion turning to alarm. 2 of them clustered together for security. A fatal error. Emily had already repositioned, circling wide. She didn't give them a target. She was a ghost, a whisper. She fired another 2-round burst. A second orange figure fell. The third spun around, firing his weapon wildly into the snow. The muzzle flashed a brilliant, useless strobe in the whiteout. He was firing at a ghost. Emily's third burst was precise, economical. He fell. The last man was smarter. He dove for cover, pressing himself behind the frozen steel legs of the relay tower. He was terrified, screaming something into his radio. Emily could have ended it then, but she had work to do. She turned her back on the last survivor and went back to the severed conduit, her weapon resting on its sling against her chest. She picked up the plasma welder. Back in the TOC, the comms officer, a young warrant officer named Reed, had been acting on a desperate hunch from Grayson. "Find out who she is," the colonel had ordered, his voice strained. "Use my override codes. Break whatever seal is on that file. I want to know who I sent up that mountain." Reed's fingers flew across his keyboard, inputting command strings and authorization codes that would have earned him a court-martial under normal circumstances. The system fought him, throwing up security warnings and access-denied messages. He bypassed them one after another until, finally, with a final override, the screen flashed. The heavily redacted file was replaced by a single stark page bordered in black. At the top was a crest none of them had ever seen before. A 3-headed chimera. Reed's breath hitched. He read the words aloud, his voice trembling with disbelief. Top secret / code word. He swallowed hard. Project Chimera. Operative designation, Shadow. Status, active, deep cover protocol. Specialization, Tier 1 direct action, special reconnaissance, asymmetric warfare. Asset is fully autonomous and disavowable. The name Shadow hung in the air of the TOC, thick and heavy with unspoken meaning. Project Chimera. It wasn't a real unit. It was a myth, a boogeyman story told by intelligence analysts to scare junior officers. They were the ghosts the government sent when they couldn't send an army. They didn't officially exist. Their operatives were legends whispered about in the highest echelons of power. On the mountain, the last insurgent peered out from behind the tower leg. He saw the figure in black, her back to him, seemingly focused on fixing the relay. He saw his chance. He raised his rifle. Before he could pull the trigger, Emily spoke, her voice calm and conversational, carried clearly by the wind. "You have one chance to drop your weapon." She didn't even turn around. The plasma welder in her hand hissed to life. The man froze, his mind unable to process how she knew he was there. His fear was overcome by desperation. He fired. The shot went wide. Emily spun, not with the welder, but with a sidearm that had appeared in her other hand. A single suppressed report, and the last orange silhouette on her display winked out. She turned back to her work. A moment later, her voice filled the stunned silence of the TOC. "Hostiles neutralized. Relay is coming back online now." The main screen in the Tactical Operations Center, which had been a dead black void for hours, flickered once, twice, and then blazed to life. A crystal-clear, high-definition image of the Anvil Valley filled the monitor. The storm was beginning to break, and in the growing light of dawn, the view was pristine. The camera panned slightly, revealing the still forms of the 4 insurgents, dark shapes against the fresh white snow. The base was no longer blind. Their eye in the sky had been restored. A collective, ragged sigh of relief went through the room. Colonel Grayson stared at the screen, then at the single green, that was Emily, already beginning its descent from the summit. He looked at the file displayed on the comms officer's monitor. Shadow. Project Chimera. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her redacted file, her impossible skills, her quiet, unnerving competence. He hadn't been sent a failed soldier. He had been sent a legend on a cool-down tour, a shark forced to swim in a fishbowl, and he, in his arrogance, had tasked her with counting inventory. The shame was a physical weight on his shoulders. Emily's return to the base was an event. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white under a pale dawn sky. As she walked through the outer gate, the soldiers on duty simply stepped aside. They had heard the comms chatter, the fractured stories spreading like wildfire from the TOC. They watched her with a new understanding, their faces a mixture of awe and a healthy dose of fear. She moved through the compound, a solitary figure in black against the snow. She was covered in a layer of frost, her face etched with fatigue, but she walked with an unwavering, determined stride. Work details stopped what they were doing. Soldiers filing out of the mess hall paused, their trays in hand, and a sergeant's barking orders fell silent. An entire military base came to a standstill to watch her pass. There was no cheering, no applause. The moment was too heavy for that. It was a silent, profound acknowledgement. They weren't just looking at a sergeant anymore. They were looking at something other, something far beyond their experience. Colonel Grayson was waiting for her outside the command center. He stood alone, his posture ramrod straight. As Emily approached, he watched her, his expression unreadable. All his assumptions had been shattered. All his rigid, by-the-book rules had been proven inadequate. She had broken protocol, defied a direct order, and in doing so had saved his entire command. She stopped a few feet from him, her frost-rimmed goggles still hiding her eyes. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. Grayson could have reprimanded her. He could have demanded an explanation. He could have asserted his authority. He did none of those things. He was a proud man, a man who had built his career on the bedrock of military order. But he was also a pragmatist. He knew when he was out of his depth. Slowly, deliberately, Colonel Grayson raised his right hand to the brim of his patrol cap. He executed a perfect, formal salute. It wasn't the casual salute given to a subordinate. It was a gesture of profound, unequivocal respect. A salute from a commander to a warrior who had proven herself to be his superior in the only arena that truly mattered, the battlefield. Emily watched him for a moment. Then she gave a short, sharp nod of her head. It was not a return salute. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. Then, without another word, she walked past him, heading for the barracks, leaving the colonel standing alone in the snow, his hands still held in a salute to the ghost who walked among them. The small, prefabricated room was Spartan, but to Emily, it was a pocket of quiet order in a chaotic world. The black operational suit lay neatly disassembled on a towel on the floor, each piece being meticulously cleaned of ice and grime. The fabric was self-repairing, the electronics hardened, but discipline dictated that gear was always maintained. It was a ritual, a way to decompress the violence and center the mind. She sat on the edge of her simple cot, the parts of her suppressed sidearm laid out on a cloth before her. With practiced, economical movements, she cleaned each component, her hands steady, her focus absolute. A soft knock came at the door. She looked up as Specialist Noah Bennett entered, holding a steaming metal mug. He looked nervous, out of place, but determined. He held the mug out to her. "I thought you could use this, Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't use her call sign. He didn't mention Project Chimera. He used the rank she wore on this base, the identity she had chosen to inhabit. It was a simple gesture, but it was deeply respectful. It acknowledged both the ghost and the soldier, and honored her right to be the latter. "Thank you, Bennett," Emily replied, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. She took the mug, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. He nodded, seeming unsure of what else to say. "We're all glad you're back," he managed, then quickly retreated, closing the door softly behind him. Emily took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, black, and bitter. It was perfect. She looked at her faint reflection in the dark window pane. The face that stared back was tired, lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes. But the eyes themselves were clear, steady, and calm. The memory of her pink jacket, of the canvas turning to ash in the burn barrel, flickered in her mind. She thought of the men she had served with, the team that had been her family. They were gone. The jacket had been the last physical piece of them, or relic of a life she could never reclaim. Its burning had hurt more than she had let on, a final severing cut from her past. But the past was not a piece of cloth. It was the skills they had taught her, the discipline they had instilled in her, the warrior they had forged. That was their true legacy. That was what had allowed her to climb the mountain, to face the storm, to save the base. Her pink jacket was gone. But the respect she had earned today was a new kind of armor, one that couldn't be burned. On a small monitor in the corner of her room, a live feed from the Argus relay played silently. It showed the Anvil Valley, serene and empty under the morning sun. The perimeter was secure. The base was safe. Her work, for now, was done. She finished cleaning her weapon, reassembling it with a final satisfying click. The silence in her room was no longer the silence of isolation, but the quiet peace of a mission accomplished, of a purpose fulfilled. Outside, the soldiers of FOB Kestrel's Perch went about their duties with a new sense of security, their gazes occasionally drifting toward the unassuming logistics depot. They knew a ghost was watching over them now, and the mountains didn't seem quite so menacing anymore. If you enjoyed Emily Harper's epic journey, hit that like button to show your support and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales of action and resilience.